Bueno, ante todo, muchas gracias a todos los presentes que están aquí hoy. Es el actividad vespertina, digamos, del seminario que organizaron Manuel Herrero con Cristina Gabriel Rosano y con Roberto Quiroz Rosado. Es un gran gusto, un privilegio, realmente creo que podemos decir, para todos los que estamos aquí presentes que esta 10ª sesión del ciclo Historia Dialogada, Clío, ante el espejo, tenga como invitado al profesor Christopher Storrs, que muy amablemente ha accedido a hablar con nosotros, con Alberto y conmigo. Por eso, Christopher, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Como también saben todos, pero... Ana, gracias Ana. Como decíamos anteriormente, ustedes conocen ya, ustedes me refiero a los que son habituales y también a aquellos que se pueden conectar online. Será 1 hora y 20, 1 hora y cuarto, 1 hora y 20 de preguntas que lanzaremos Alberto y yo para posteriormente hacer preguntas del público. También hemos dicho que va a ser en inglés, va a ser en inglés, por lo tanto agradeceríamos también que las preguntas sean en ese idioma. Dicho esto, y para no perder más tiempo y aprovechar al profesor Storrs. Thank you, Christopher, for coming here. It's a huge honor for us, for Alberto and I, to have you here in the Universidad Autónoma.
Could I just say thank you very much for inviting me? It's a great honor to be here. And I'm very sorry that I'm not speaking in Spanish. It's shocking. Really, it's quite shocking that I'm not speaking in Spanish, but that's the way it is. So that's how we carry on.
Don't worry. We would like to start asking you, during your first years as a PhD candidate, who was that key influence, historian or mentor in your early years that you think helped you to like kind of shape your historical vision and the way you wanted to approach history?
Well, actually, I want to begin a little bit earlier because the most important influences on me as a historian are my school teachers, because they introduced me to history and the endless fascination and wonder of history. I think it's the best degree anybody could do. It sets you up for life. Having said that, when I was starting out my research, I suppose the key influences were people at the London School of Economics, the Department of International History, which is a history of diplomacy and international relations. And in particular, I suppose, Professor R.M. Hatton, who some of you may be familiar with that name, the Swedish historian who did a great deal of work on the international history, more or less the same period as Louis XIV. But she produced a number of historians who worked on international history, diplomatic history, between about 1660 and 1720.
Okay. And during those years, we like to make this kind of a conversations with other historians, trying to mix what they told us before and the information you can bring here. And many of them said that during their early years as PhD candidates, they had two historiographical influences that were, on the one hand, the annales, on the one hand, and on the other hand, some of them mentioned the group of British Marxist historians. So we would like to know if that kind of work of research had an impact on your early years.
On the whole, as a British trained historian, we set aside all ideological approaches. We're very pragmatic, and I think diplomatic historians are probably more pragmatic than most others. So we tend to avoid Marxist historians. The annal historians, I didn't have much to do with them until relatively recently. In the last few years, teaching a course called Making History about various historiographical approaches, I got quite interested in the annal historians for their approach in terms of mortality. And one of my future projects, I hope, is to read I have at home, I have lots and lots of photocopies of Consultas de Estado from the reign of Carlos II. And I want to read those to get an idea of the mindset, the mentality of the ruling elite of Carlos II Spain. So the annal historians, in a sense, I've got more interested in them more recently.
Okay. Before letting Alberto continue with the questions, we would like to focus to make a specific. We would like to make specific questions about your relationship with Spanish history, or with Carlos II, and then other topics. But before, as a non-native Spanish speaker, how difficult is for you to work with documents from 17th or 18th century documents that are written in Spanish?
Right.
Do you remember those first encounters in Simancas, for example, on the Archivo Histórico Nacional? How were those first trying to understand what were you reading and the difficulties involved in that process?
I like the way you framed that question. You started it with the fact that I'm a non-native speaker, and it's very obvious because of the way I'm speaking to you today. But yes, in a way, I'm very lucky because if you look at 16th century Spanish manuscripts, they are much harder to read than our 17th and 18th century Spanish manuscripts. So I'm very lucky in that respect. But yes, I do remember when the first time I went to Simancas, and all these things that struck me. Well, it's an archive in a castle, and that's amazing.
That's amazing,
right? So we're familiar with the expression "Castillos en España,"
yes.
but this one actually really existed. But the other thing that struck me about Simancas was this thing called a legajo, which I'd never met a legajo before. And above all, the very curious system of knots whereby they're held together. And so I think the first time I was there and I read a legajo and I wanted to hand it back. And one of the staff at the archive said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "Yes." So he said, "Well, you had better learn how to tie a Simancas legajo knot." And I still haven't done it. And somebody said to me once that his reply to this question was, "I'm not a marinero." But yeah, Simancas is wonderful.
It is, actually.
Yeah, I like the atmosphere in Simancas. It's very much like a social club. It's a bit like family. And you get to know people in a way I think you don't in the Archivo Histórico Nacional. The Archivo Histórico Nacional is a very fine archive. It's got wonderful materials in it, but it's not quite the same as Simancas, perhaps because a lot of the people at Simancas, they live in Valladolid, and they used to be the boss. And when I first went, there was an afternoon session, and I think it was Manolo was the driver of the bus. He would take you into Valladolid for lunch. You would have your menu del dia, and then get the bus back for the afternoon session. It was wonderful.
Still regarding archives, do you or what are the main differences in perhaps organization or difficulty to get the documents? The main differences you can see between, for example, Simancas, the Spanish archives, and the British archives. The main differences.
Yeah, on the whole, I think it's easier in Britain. I'm thinking here about either the British Library or the National Archives. But in a way, it might just be easier for me because I'm British, and so my mindset is just attuned better to the system in Britain. One of the problems that began to exist in Spain was they cut the hours.
They did.
Right, and I don't think this is something peculiar to foreigners. I think Spaniards who, for example, lived in Seville or Madrid and wanted to come and do work in Simancas you also would have to spend a night or two in Valladolid, and it means your research project would get that little bit more expensive. So it wasn't just a problem for foreigners. But now I think it's splendid that they've returned to the older system of afternoon sessions.
Alberto, let's talk about Europe in the second half of 17th century. In 1975, Chantilly wrote that war made the state and the state made the war. In relation for the formation of national states in Western Europe, considering, for example, the Spanish War succession, the 9 Years' War, how would you say that this assumption of Tilly applies to race that France, Spain, Portugal, England?
Well, I think the state that I'm most familiar with at the moment, I must say that in recent years, I've been looking more at England because English materials, British materials are more easily available to me.
Yeah.
The war made the English or British state in the 1690s because we tend to think of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 as this groundbreaking moment when William of Orange's intervention in Britain saved Parliament and ensured that thereafter it would be a constitutional monarchy. But it's increasingly clear, it has been for a number of decades, that what really ensured the preservation of Parliament was William's intervention in the 9 Years' War. Because William needed money to fight the war, and this meant he had to call Parliament. And this is what really ensured that 18th century Britain and Britain today is a constitutional monarchy. But I think we need to challenge Tilly a little bit, because in some respects, war could break a state. Now, there are some very obvious examples here. One is the long-term evolution of the French state. So the accumulated debt based upon many wars is what brought the Bourbon monarchy down in the 1780s and 90s. But also, thinking back to the end of the 17th century, the British historian, my colleague at St Andrews, Guy Rowlands, he has done a lot of work on the way in the War of the Spanish Succession. The challenge of financing the war really began, absolutism began to unravel. So that when Louis XIV dies in 1715, absolutism in France is not quite the same thing as it had been in, say, 1680 at the peak of the absolutist state. I'd also draw your attention to another example, which is the Savoyard state, which I spent a lot of time studying. The Savoyard state on the eve of the 9 Years' War is a confessional state. It's an essentially Catholic state where the dukes insist on their subjects being Orthodox Catholics, and they have no truck with Protestant heresy. But the price of English and Dutch support in the war, that they give him subsidies, they said, we insist that you have toleration, religious toleration for your Protestant Vaudois, Waldensian subject. So the state is actually reconfigured, and it sort of breaks down that confessionalism to a degree. So war may make the state may make war, but it's actually much more complex than I think Charles Tilly's formulation allows.
Moving forward to his history of the Spanish monarchy, and before going deep into Charles II, Carlos II, why Carlos II? What does he have or his kingdom have that make you feel like so interested in getting to know all the little details and all the research and investigations you've made during these, let's say, 30 or even 35 years?
Yeah.
What has Carlos?
So what is his charisma? Right now, this isn't something you associate with Carlos II normally, but okay. So in fact, I go back to my PhD, which was on relations between William III and the Duke of Savoy in the 9 Years' War. And it became very clear to me that the Duke of Savoy depended enormously on the support of outside powers. I've already referred to his dependence on William III and the Dutch for giving him subsidies. But he also depended on Spain, because when he decided to break with Louis XIV in the summer of 1690, he did so in expectation of the support from neighboring Milan, the army of Lombardy. Also, the fact that the Spanish galley fleets, Spain has about 30 galleys in the Mediterranean in 1690, almost. The numbers fluctuate. But he thinks these might help me defend Nice, which is his only coastal territory on the Mediterranean. So for Victor Amadeus, Spain is actually quite an important source of military and naval support. And so I thought, hang on, people are telling me Spain is not important, it's very weak, nobody thinks it's very strong, but actually here is a relatively small Italian prince neighboring Spanish Italy, and he thinks, well, this could be a great chance for me. Now, he was soon disappointed, but how he saw things in 1690. He also has a claim on the Spanish succession. So he thinks, if I do Madrid a good turn, maybe Madrid will do some other things to me in terms of the Spanish succession. He is written into Philip IV's will.
So when you first started reading about Carlos II and Charles II, together with Alberto, we were trying to summarize the English historiography about Charles II. We encountered with, we would say, three different moments. In 1961, John Eliot wrote that article about the decline of Spain, which was basically a continuation of this catastrophic vision of Carlos II's reign. Then in 1980, Henry Kamen and Robert Stradlin, they were trying to kind of make a difference in that image, but still they were considering territories in Europe. They weren't considering perhaps in America or in Flanders. And then in 2006, when you got the resilience concept to describe Charles II, we saw those three moments. So in your opinion, after all these years, how would you describe the way, at least in the British or English historiography, how is it perceived, the kingdom of Charles II?
I would suggest that, well, there are two worlds of opinion here. One is the world, the academic world, in which people read these things, and there is the broader public which doesn't. And that broader public, probably these older ideas persist. Eliot's view was just too extreme.
It was
too extreme. It sees that when he's at the dissolution of Spanish power in the 1640s, this is a very temporary phenomenon, right? And so it's not really surprising that Spain bounces back after this crisis in the 1640s, which you may remember the work of Merriman, 6 contemporaneous revolutions. This is a very, very time-specific crisis. And Eliot, whose work was essentially about Olivares, which culminates in the 1640s and doesn't go beyond it. So like many of us who have a specific research project and we try and broaden the implications, I think Eliot just went too far in saying, well, after the fall of Olivares, that's Spain consigned to the dustbin of history. It's just not credible. Kamen, I find Kamen influenced me because I think this is something you may want to touch on later. He talked about this dark ages of Spanish historiography, and I thought, okay, I've got this idea about the Duke of Savoy and Spain, and Kamen's saying it's just not been looked at. So this is a wonderful opportunity for a historian to open up something which has been, in effect, not just closed, but not really looked at all. So I think the world has moved on enormously since Eliot wrote what he did in 1961.
So Alberto is going to continue.
Let's continue about the talk to Savoy. In your book, War, Diplomacy, and the Rise of Savoy, you write that between 1690 and 1713, Savoy transformed from a minor European state to a power, deserving a real recognition in the country, in Europe. In your opinion, what were the key factors that contribute to this transformation in the year?
Right. Well, the Duchy of Savoy has this incredibly important strategic position in the Po Valley, at the extreme west end of the Po Valley, dominating the Alpine passages which lead into Provence, Dauphiné, and the south of France generally. So if the Duke of Savoy could help the Allies get into France, they might provoke widespread rebellion amongst the Huguenot population, which resents the repressive measures of Louis XIV, and mean that Louis XIV cannot fight his wars in Flanders, on the Rhine, and so on. He'll have to divert troops from those other places, and he will, in the end, have very soon to seek peace with the Allies. So he's got this wonderful strategic position, but also he, in many respects, I think you just can't get away from the idea of the great man in history, right? The Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, not necessarily his son or grandson, but Victor Amadeus himself was a remarkable figure. And he made an enormous gamble in 1691. It was very risky because his state could have been occupied by the French. He could have been dethroned, sent into exile, but he took this gamble and it succeeded. When he abdicated in 1730, Europe was astonished. Here is this man who has been astonishing Europe ever since 1690, and he does it again, right? Most people don't give up power willingly. And he, rather like Philip V of Spain in 1724, abdicated, and people were really astonished. He was a remarkable personality, and I think that's an important part of the transformation of the Savoyard state. He ran the system himself. So, for example, Savoyard diplomats, they wrote to him. He gave them advice. He was a very effective leader in many respects, clearly very intelligent.
One of the main arguments of this book is the difference in terms of governance or state building between Savoy and France. Let's talk a little bit about this.
Right. Okay. In 1983, Geoffrey Simcox published a study of Victor Amadeus's reign, and he called it Absolutism in the Savoyard State. Now, he was modeling his study of the Savoyard state on Louis XIV's absolutism. Now, one of the things that's interesting is by 1983, already the historiography was moving against the idea of absolutism. There's been a whole generation or more of historians who no longer buy into the whole historiography of absolutism as it's been traditionally understood. But actually, I'm increasingly of the view that we do see what we might think of as absolutism in a lot of small states, partly because the territory is so much smaller, it is more easily controlled than in a bigger state. And I do see Victor Amadeus. I've just said he was a remarkable person. In many respects, he was also quite unattractive because he was very domineering. He refused to allow his subjects to talk, for example, to foreign ambassadors in Turin. And this is just one way he had of controlling flows of information. So I'm suggesting then that we might think about reintroducing absolutism into our frameworks of interpretation of early modern states, but perhaps it's better observed in those smaller states, maybe some of the German states as well.
Last week, Professor Alvarez Osorio argued that behind Louis XVI, there was a vertical construction of a rural image, while in the case of Carlos II, a more collective process can be observed. How would you describe the example of Victor Amadeus II in this context?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that I'm that aware of all that many images of Victor Amadeus. But I think if some were to be found, I suspect it would all be top down. It would all be coming from the centre, from the court. But I want to add something here. It's very fashionable in the historiography to look at the fashioning of images, the presentation of images, visual and otherwise. And I'm not entirely convinced by all this. I keep wanting to ask, yes, this may be what the court wanted to do, but how did people respond? Did people buy into this propaganda of the visual image? And I see very little evidence of responses. Did people say, oh, doesn't he look lovely? Or isn't that a wonderful image of power and I should obey? It's very difficult to get at such.
It is.
Where are we going to find it? In letters, in journals? So it seems to me all this visual projection stuff is still to be explored and proven.
Moving forward to the transition between the 17th and the 18th century, and coming back to Carlos II, one of the most important aspects about his death is by the time, by November of 1700, the Spanish monarchy remained largely, completely intact in terms of territories. However, 15 years later, after the War of Spanish Succession, we've got the Italian territories, Colonia Sacramento, we talked about Gibraltar, Menorca. So why is it still believed, or perhaps not that much, but there's still the image of the Habsburg dynasty rather than the Bourbon dynasty, as the one that destroyed, let's say, that imperial world of the Spanish monarchy? Why is it still a common thought that during Carlos II's reign, the Spanish monarchy lost all the territories when, in fact, we know that it didn't, or were short periods of time?
I think it's something to do with the lack of impact of a lot of the new research. And this idea that in the 1660s, the War of Devolution was the first of these major wars in which major losses occur in Flanders. And it's followed by Louis XIV's Dutch War and Spain, which initially steps in to help the Dutch. And then Louis turns the war against Spain, and Spain loses out in quite a big way. And then we have the war for Luxembourg, and Spain loses out again. And so people say, well, this is a terrible record of losses and so on. And so it's not surprising by 1700, it's almost all gone. But in reality, very, very different. And I think people just haven't really looked enough at the actual record, because at the end of the 9 Years' War, Spain recovers Luxembourg, for example. This to me is a very good example of the way Spain is able to recover some of the former losses. But people are looking at the first decades and they're forgetting, or well, if they didn't know in the first place, they couldn't forget. But yes, they ignore the fact that in fact there is some recovery of lost ground in the later years.
Well, as we talk about the War of the Spanish Succession, how did this war help in the formation of Great Britain? Because you have a paper about this thing.
Right. Well, in many respects. So, for one thing, there's a continuation of the pressures and responses of the 9 Years' War. So, I said some moments ago that the 9 Years' War, the cost of fighting it, and the need to resort to Parliament, this continued. So, under Queen Anne, the successor to William III, that parliamentary system is further entrenched in the British political system. But the most important thing, of course, is the union with Scotland. So Scotland until 1707 is independent. It has its own parliament, and there is the possibility that Scotland will pursue a different foreign policy to England. And you could end up here with Scotland perhaps even allying with the Bourbons. And so the English government would have to put troops on the border with Scotland, which would be a distraction from the war in Flanders. So when, for example, in 1708, Louis XIV backs an invasion attempt by the Pretender, you remember the baby in the warming pan? And so the English have to withdraw troops from Flanders. The invasion gets nowhere, but it is a problem. So the Union, it seems to me, the Union still exists, although there are a lot of people in Scotland would like to dissolve it, but it still exists. And this is one of the great creations of the War of the Spanish Succession. And of course, we have Gibraltar. I know this is a sensitive subject.
It's a sensitive matter. But between the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession, there's a really important and really interesting article you wrote about the information, the gathering information, the diplomats gathering information in those years. And we would like to know what role did those ambassadors, for example, the Savoyan ambassador in the Carlos in Spain during Carlos II reign, what role did they have in these information gathering networks in Europe during that period between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, in those 30 years of war?
Right. Well, diplomats, this is one of their essential functions, to gather information or intelligence. And in fact, one of my big projects at the moment is intelligence and espionage in the early modern period more generally. Right? And it's a fascinating subject. It's increasingly clear to me that as time goes on, more and more information is actually fairly easily obtained. So you have gazettes, you have all sorts of information which is publicly available, but there is information about the formation of state policy and so on, which is secret, as it were. So you perhaps have to buy a secretary in the Secretary of State's office. You have to corrupt somebody. This is a different variant of corruption to that Andújar talks about. Right? This is real corruption, I think. But yes, one of the there is a Savoyard diplomat in Madrid from 1690, Operti, and he's there for a decade. Yes. So he develops a great deal of expertise about understanding Spain and its situation, and he also collects a lot of the pamphlets and print publications, and he sends them to Turin. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to find these in the Archivio di Stato in Turin. Now, I'm just wondering what on earth happened to this. Must be a wonderful collection of printed material from the last decade of Carlos II. But anyway, so Operti is quite an important figure. In the longer he's in post, the longer any diplomat is in post in any capital, they just get a good feel for the country, its politics, the political situation. So Operti would be a pretty good observer and, in a sense, thinking about interpreting the information that he's getting, because interpretation is actually quite an important aspect of information gathering, I think.
Yeah, Alberto is going to continue with them.
Let's continue about the concept that you use several times in so many papers. That is a fiscal military state. Why it is appropriate? This is really a good discussion about this concept. Why it is appreciated to use this concept for the 18th century?
Okay, I think essentially, and I think this is true of the 17th as well as the 18th century, the fiscal military state is the idea that the state is about making war, a little bit like the Tilly notion, and that its fiscal policy, its tax policy, is driven by the need to raise money by taxation and or borrowing, the development of a debt, to pay for armies and navies which generally exceed, say, short-term annual revenues. Now, I don't think there's a single model because all states differ. Some states may be, some states, their revenues could perhaps be in a very primitive state. They could be in the form of kind. Yeah, so I think the Swedish state initially, a lot of its revenues are in kind rather than in cash. And they then maybe have to try and turn kind into a cash. Some historians also say, well, actually, some states are military fiscal rather than fiscal military. Now, military fiscal states are those which have a lot of military resource in terms of manpower who can be conscripted into an army. So Russia might be a good example of a military fiscal state. It has enormous armies, but it might be rather weak in terms of being able to pay for those men. So they might seek subsidies from foreign states like, say, Britain and the Dutch, which have quite advanced, complex economies, which are can be used, the complexity can be turned into a cash generating mechanism. So they have a lot of trade, and you impose customs, rather like Mr. Trump and his tariff. Well, you may have other questions on the fiscal military state. It's a complex subject.
It's a complex.
What led you not to classify the United Province of Netherlands or Sweden as fiscal military state, because it's another model of state.
and the United Provinces are in a good position to actually generate revenues through trade. When I didn't classify them or include them as fiscal military states, I was talking, this was a collection of essays on the 18th century.
It was.
And of course, in the 18th century, I think I may have made this point earlier today, that after 1713, one of the most remarkable developments in Europe and its international relations is the way the Dutch abandon the role of a great power. And it's because they emerged from the War of the Spanish Succession with an enormous debt, which I think they're just overwhelmed by it. And they say, we can no longer play the role of a great power. And everybody's surprised. Victor Amadeus II, for example, he has emerged since 1690 on the back of support by the Dutch. And so he's always saying, where are the Dutch? But they're nowhere because they don't want to play that supporting role anymore. And as for Sweden, well, of course, Sweden more or less at the same time disappears from the great power struggle. In all our discussions these last few days, we haven't said anything about the Great Northern War, which is being fought at more or less the same time. And all these surrounding powers in the Baltic and North Germany, they all gang up on Sweden. And Sweden emerges from this as a much weaker power. It retains Finland, but very little else. And so Sweden, after 1718, is no longer really a great military power and no longer really aspires to be one. So it's not really bothered to generate the tax revenues which will pay for a big army and navy.
And moving forward to one of perhaps your most important books, it's the Spanish Resurgence between 1713 and 1748 after the War of Spanish Succession. And the first question we would like to ask is, why do you choose the word resurgence, and what were those first factors or documents that lead you to believe that there was kind of a new Spain in a way. Spain was going out of war of Spanish succession and trying to go back to that perhaps most important period in the late 16th century or the first 20, 15 years of the 17th century. The war resurgence.
Okay, now I want to sort of begin with the importance of concepts in our work as historians. I think all of you doing postgraduate work, you need to think about the concepts you are using, and you need to, if you're not using concepts already, quick, invent one. Well, this is, and I'm going to go back to my earlier work on Spain, because I talk about resilience.
Resilience.
And I think it's a really interesting term. Well, I would, wouldn't I? And when it was translated into Spanish, the title given to the book was Resistencia.
The original one.
Yeah. And I now regret accepting the suggestion that it should be called, because I think resistance implies something very different. I think the notion of resilience is really much more precise and nuanced, because it seems to me that what late 17th century Spain, the Spain of Carlos II, does suffer a great deal, but what it shows is resilience. It shows an ability to suffer these attacks and setbacks, but it's always still there. And so it seems to me that resistance doesn't really convey that in the way that resilience does. That for the king, the people around him, the titulados and grandes, the population at large, they're sort of buying into this. Well, we're going to maintain this thing we know, and there's the Spanish polity and the monarchy. So we then get to resurgence. Well, it's an interesting.
It is.
It's an interesting concept. Well, I'm glad you like it. So I think, well, there are two things going on after 1713. One is that Philip V has got an agenda, right? He wants to recover all that he had lost. And we must remember that his title to rule in Spain is the will of Carlos II. Carlos II left him an inheritance. And I think Philip thinks, I've got an obligation
Here.
to hand on to my children intact what I inherited from Carlos II. I mean, there are other things going on as well, but he and his ministers are, if you like, channeling Spain's resources into this project of resurgence. Now, the success of the resurgence is not only due to Spain's own resources, right? It's also due to the international situation. And it's arguable that the success of Spain in this period is due in very large part to the weakness of the powers who might restrain Spain. So, and in both France and Britain, they are dynastically weak. So the new Hanoverian regime in Britain, we have the threat of the Jacobites. And the Jacobites are always going, they're going around Europe, they go to St. Petersburg, they go to Madrid and say, hey, you've got a problem with Britain? Well, support us and we'll kick King George out and we will pursue a foreign policy favourable to, we will restore you.
We'll restore you. And
similarly in France, where Louis XIV's death leaves a 5-year-old child, and Philip V has got ambitions, despite his renunciation, to rule in France. And so the regent, the Duke of Orleans, he's at odds with Philip V. And this is very, very odd. In this, somebody earlier today, I think, or yesterday, referred to the Second 100 Years' War. And in fact, between 1716 and 31, England and France are allies. That is an astonishing, that's a diplomatic revolution. There are far too many diplomatic revolutions in 18th century, but here's another one.
Diplomatic revolution. and trying to combine Charles II and Philip V. To what extent did the reign of Charles II lay the foundations for that resurgence? To what extent is Philip V's abilities and Charles II way he left the empire?
Well, I suppose the simple answer has been all these historical questions. Well, in part this, in part that. But yes, okay. So Carlos II leaves. We've already mentioned this. Leaves an empire which is in much better shape in terms of simple territorial extent, which is in better condition than historians used to believe. It's also, people are now much more aware of the extent to which he leaves an institutional structure. So I think of the work of people like Julio Munoz, who talk about the way there are new offices being developed in the last decade or so, which are looking forward to some of the institutional structure innovations that happen under Philip V. So yes, there's a Philip V to some extent inherits, but he also innovates. And of course, Carlos II was never married to Isabel Farnese. So, and she is also, well, in terms of personalities, individuals matter enormously in these ancien regime states. Yes. People all over Europe are saying, diplomatic reports, they say that woman, Isabel Farnese, you just don't know what they're going to do next.
With Alberoni, together with Alberoni around
yeah,
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And talking about Isabel and Alberoni, what is your, and I taking into consideration what we've spoken before, what is your general assessment of Philip V's policy in the Mediterranean during those 35 years you analyze in the book? What is your general opinion, or what was he a success?
Whoa! How on earth do you measure success? And is it long-term success, short-term success? Is he achieving his objectives or not? On the whole, I'm quite impressed. One of the most obvious differences between the two is that because Spain has lost so much in the War of the Spanish Succession, Philip V is taking the initiative in a way which was not the case under Carlos II. Under Carlos II, the policy is conservación, keeping what you have. But Philip V is having to take back what we've lost. So that's one very different issue, I think. There are obviously some big failures. So we have this remarkable invasion of Sardinia and then Sicily, 1717-18, but it goes wrong. And the Spanish fleet that has just been rebuilt since the Peace of Utrecht is more or less destroyed in Sicilian waters by the English fleet. This is probably the least well-known Spanish disaster at the hands of the British fleet that you are probably aware of. At Cape Passaro. But there are lots of successes. And Philip V actually forces the European powers to rewrite the Treaty of Utrecht. So in 1713, the Kingdom of Sicily is given to the Duke of Savoy. But by 1735, Sicily and Naples, which had been given to the emperor in the War of Succession, these are now occupied by the son of Philip V, and so the Mediterranean is getting a little bit more like a Spanish lake than it had been for most of the last generation. This is remarkable.
This is remarkable. And before going forward, we'd like to ask some questions about this book, taking into consideration like the main topic of the book, which is this resurgence of the monarchy. You mentioned that the War of the Quadruple Alliance, la Guerra de la Cuádruple Alianza, was, in terms of comparison to other wars, it was a short one, a really short one, and a war that was fought in really small places, like a small quantity of places, just 3 or 4. But you also mentioned that it was a victory of diplomacy. the war of Purple Alliance. What made you believe that diplomacy and ambassadors made it a less tougher war than it would have been if those ambassadors hadn't done their work, hadn't done their job?
Okay, this is something I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment. Well, we live in a world in which people are thinking a great deal about what diplomacy is. We've seen some terrible examples of diplomacy, or supposed diplomacy, in the last few weeks, right? So I'm very interested in what diplomacy actually means. It's not merely a deal. But diplomacy has a relationship, I think, to real power, as it were. And what I think we see in the War of the Quadruple Alliance, by the way, this is one of Europe's least well-known wars and merits a great deal more investigation. But I think the war doesn't explode into a great war because Spain just doesn't have enough allies or potential allies. Spain is effectively isolated, and I think this makes the work of the diplomats so much easier. And although Philip V and Alberoni have rebuilt Spain's military and naval resources since 1713, it's just not enough to face England and France and the Emperor, and the Dutch sort of, but not quite, and the Duke of Savoy. The Spanish court tries to buy the support of the Duke of Savoy, but this is a war in which the Duke of Savoy is exposed very much as a secondary rank power. He's done very well since 1690, but he is not one of the big five powers. And so it seems to me that the realities of power, armies and navies, facilitate the work of the diplomats. Their job is made a lot easier.
Well, in the previous session in the morning of the seminar, you have criticized a little bit the concept of polycentric monarchies. Well, you know that this is a great idea about the Philip V reign that presents as an absolute, centralized, unified Spanish national monarchy. How we can break with this concept?
All right. Yeah. Again, a very interesting concept. Interesting, not least because it gets us to think about the implications of the concept and whether it's helpful to us in understanding and exploring a past society. And that, of course, is what we're all doing in our researches. But polycentric, I'm just not sure about this. I suppose I understand it as being developed in an attempt to explain late Habsburg Spain, but more broadly Habsburg Spain. But I can see it might apply to Bourbon Spain as well. The implication being, and I'm not entirely sure, does it mean that all the big centres throughout the monarchy, so it might be Barcelona, or Valencia, or Zaragoza, or Bilbao, or Santiago de Compostela, or Valladolid, Salamanca, Lima, Simancas not, Nápoles, Palermo, Messina. There is a big contest between Messina and Palermo. Now that they might fit in this construct of a polycentric because Madrid plays off these two as rivals with grants of privilege, and then we get the Messina revolt precisely because it thinks it's not being properly treated in this possibly polycentric system. But I'm just not sure that I see a system where local, somewhere like, I don't know, Valladolid is regarded as something of equal weight to Madrid. In a polycentric system, each of these centres has equal weight. And in fact, the Spanish system, the synodal system, the conciliar system, is one in which there is a centre and a system of central councils which coordinate policy on behalf of the monarchy overall. So to me, it's a very centralised system. And in a way, I suppose I would prefer Eliot's system of composite states, which are sort of equal, but they aren't all polycentric in the sense each of their provincial capitals is a centre of itself, pursuing independent policies and so on. I'm just not sure whether you all buy into polycentric, a polycentric polity.
Well, moving to a different topic about the public history, besides publishing scholarly articles, book chapters, monograph, you have also contributed to publication aimed to a broader audience, such as your work in Despertaferro and other papers. How do you approach the challenge of writing for readers who have an interest of history but may not be specialists in your particular field?
Well, writing for Despertaferro is brilliant. They have all this state-of-the-art technology for doing very good visuals. And my students, they love reading a few pages, lots and lots of words, and then there's a picture, right? Because it breaks up the text, and it means the article and book chapter isn't so long to read. But it is really great. You can convey a lot of information in an image. I also have to confess that when I was a very poor postgraduate student, I wrote some entries for the Guinness Encyclopedia of World History. And it was a really great training in writing for a broader public. And you try to convey information and ideas in not too academic, scholarly, difficult to understand wording. So I think it's really great that we engage. Some people, I know, particularly in the universities, in the academic world, worry about the future of history, but I don't. I think the appetite amongst the general public for history is enormous. People want to read about history. They want to watch history films. They want to watch television programs about history. And there will always be a demand for history. So you should not be pessimistic about your future. There is. Yeah. I've done it all, so I'm not looking for this future. But it's wonderful. The way people just want history. They do. And public history is a great thing. I don't know about the situation here in Spain, but in Britain, there are all these programs where they take celebrities and they say, who are you? And they trace their family history. Right? But there's also another program where a historian, he takes a house in a street, right? And he says, well, let's explore who lived in this house. So he did a program about a house in Liverpool over 200 years. And it was fascinating about the way families lived, how many people were in a family, servants they had with them, how they adapted the various rooms in the house, and what it said about the changing economy of the city. So there are all sorts of inventive ways to do public history. Yeah, public history is great.
We talked about public history, but we also like to know your opinion about something that is quite particular about your say your research, is that you like to publish reviews of many of the books you've read during all these years, and also writing a review of a reseña, a review book. It tends to be, for perhaps not all of historians, but quite a group, a tedious task, something that requires time and effort. But it's still, when we read some of your reviews, it's quite fascinating to see the way you just summarize the whole book and the most important aspects. So what do you value about doing a review? What do you find interesting about getting a book, reading 300, 400, 500 pages, whatever, and trying to make public your opinion of what you read? What's magic about writing a review, in your
I
opinion?
don't think there's anything magic about it, but well, hang on. It's an essential part of what we do. It's one of the things we're expected to do as professional historians. So if you're not doing it, you really need to get on doing some reviewing. In fact, I have about 2 or 3 books to review when I get home.
They're waiting there.
But look, we do have a responsibility to read these books and give an opinion on them. People say, well, hang on, you claim to be an expert on the Asiento de Negros.
Okay.
This book claims to say something new about the Asiento. Is it true? Is the claim justified? So you say, well, hang on, what's the argument? What's it based on in terms of the archival materials? And is this person using the archival materials in a critical way and professionally? One of the things I feel very much when I'm reviewing is most academic books, particularly in my country, are enormously expensive. I don't know if you read Brill books published in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
They are the most expensive books I've ever come across. And the only ones I have are ones I've been sent to review. All that I've contributed to. So I can't. Yeah. So it's a way of getting hold of books. But also, look, we live in a very, very crowded academic world, right? All of you are probably hoping to publish books, right? And that means you're forcing even more books on this world of possible readership. And there's this public which doesn't know, may not know. I mean, our audience is probably a rather specialized one, professional historians. But I think it's a great test of our own knowledge and understanding. So here's somebody claiming something really important and new about the Asiento. Wow, I'm interested in that because this is one of the things that is part of my historical world, as it were. Spain, its policy, internationally, and so on. So I should want to read it. But reviewing is also, I think, a way of keeping up with the field because, well, I'm sure there are historians who they don't even read the books now. They read the reviews, right? I know sometimes. Well, I urge students always to read book reviews. Any book they're thinking of using, read a book review as well, because you'll get a sense of the things that are good about this book, where it might not be so good. It might tell you, set it in the historiographical context, but also identify the sources and how they're being used. So reviewing is important.
Well, through your career, you have maintained a close connection with Spanish historiography, participating in conference, publishing in a specialist journal, and collaborating with Spanish Historia. How would you describe your relationship with Spanish historiography, and what impact has it had on your understanding of the history of the Spanish monarchy?
Well, it must be crucial. English and English-speaking and writing historians don't address the issues that I'm interested in quite the way that Spanish historians do, of course. And I should add here that, look, when I started out, Spanish history, particularly of the early modern period, was dominated by the Anglo-Saxons.
It was.
Right?
It was.
And now it's not. I think it's really splendid. Look, I'm in this room and I see all these amazing young Spanish historians who are saying to all we Anglo-Saxons, "Well, right?" Because it's great. What I mean, I just think about people like Roberto Quiros and Cristina Bravo, and they're doing splendid things. But there's so many more of you, and it's great. You should be, in a sense, asserting yourselves and saying, "We are the ancien regime," right? and you've got all these new things to find out and relate to us. Thinking a little bit more critically, I wonder if Spanish historiography is a little bit too inclined to say, aren't our maestros wonderful? And also, I find one of the oddest things here is the distinction between Spain and America. In Spain, you're either a historian of Spain or you're a historian of Spanish America. And yet, the two are so closely connected that you can't really be a historian of one or the other. So, yeah, some very positive things, but I'm sure it's changing. One hopes so. I get lost in the proliferation of journals. When I go on Dialnet, and just so many new journals, and all of them are digitized, which is wonderful on Dialnet. I don't have to leave home. But no, it's a thriving world.
It is.
Spanish historiography is I think it's doing very well.
And we've got two last questions before giving the words to the ones who are here in the room. Ever since you started writing up until now, there have been many subjects. You talked about Charles II, Savoy, the fiscal military state, the war of Spanish succession, and too many other things. But how would you describe your personal evolution as a historian? The way you treated history when you began, like 30, 35, 40 years ago, and now, is it the same, the way you approach to history, or has it changed because of your experiences, the people you've met, the books you've read, and or perhaps another factors around there?
I think I'm thinking, I hope so, but I'm not entirely sure. I was thinking about this. I think I've gone full circle. Okay. I started out as a diplomatic historian, a historian of international relations, and I think I'm coming back to it. So rather than an evolution of method, I think there's been some sort of evolution, but actually a circle, in terms of subjects and interest. And in part, that's because of the world I live in. To some extent, the research projects that I do, I try and respond to the world I live in. So when the Iraq War broke out, was it 2001, and all the talk in my country was the dodgy dossier, the intelligence dossier that justified going to war in Iraq, which was subsequently exposed as based on very poor intelligence. And I thought, oh, I don't think many people have looked at intelligence in the formation of policy under Carlos II, because in Carlos II Spain, when the armies are short of men, you think, well, we really need to know if Louis XIV is going to invade in Flanders or in Catalonia, because if he's invading in Flanders, we need to move men from Catalonia to Flanders and ensure the Flanders front has got lots and lots of men on it. So I started doing some work on intelligence. And as I made a reference a few moments ago to the fact that right now, diplomacy and how you end wars, right, is a very, very contemporary subject. And so I'm sort of getting interested again in how diplomats and diplomacy works. So, yeah, and I think that in a way, one way to ensure your work gets published is to make sure that not only it appeals to that academic scholarly audience, but also particularly if you want to have a book published by a publisher who thinks, well, there's a bigger demand out there which we might tap into, you might want to address issues which are contemporary now. The future, one of the things of the future, of course, is climate change. And so climate history is, I think, a growth subject. And there's who's that? What is it? Rocío Ben Yesef. Sorry, she did a big book on the Genoese family, and she's now moved on to environmental history. That's my understanding. So all sorts of possibilities are there. Maybe try and get ahead of the game by becoming a futurologist and saying, hey, this is the subject for the future.
And to finish with our questions, what advice do you have for the young historians, for the ones who are trying to get into this world of research, teaching, knowledge, reading, in view of what you've seen all those years and what you are seeing right now? What 2 or 3 perhaps advices for?
Right. This is a very unfair question, or 2 or 3 or 4. Well, it's very difficult, because when I started out, the way academia worked in Britain was changing. Mrs. Thatcher thought that the universities were full of people who were very lazy. And so she introduced a system of assessment where academics, historians and others were assessed on the basis of how much research they did. But that really meant how many publications they had. Now, I just don't know what the situation is like here, whether you have a system like this, or whether it will be introduced as governments are under more and more pressure to justify expenditure on universities. So it may happen. I think the essential thing is to make sure you enjoy it, right? I think history is great fun. I'm off to Valladolid as soon as we finish here, because I'm going to Simancas tomorrow and half of Friday, but it's not open all day Friday. But look, it's wonderful doing research. The real problem actually is writing it up for publication. The great fun of being a historian is the research. But yeah, make sure you find it interesting, rewarding for you. It may be, look, the number of PhDs who actually get jobs in universities is quite a low proportion, right? So whatever you do, just make sure that, you know, it could be something you look back on and you say, hey, they were great days. Well, hopefully you may go on to do something which is, you could go on to be prime minister or something. I have no idea, and that may be even more rewarding. But yes, it's got to be interesting and gives you that enormous sense of joy and self-satisfaction that you were doing something interesting and even useful.
Okay, so dejamos turno para las preguntas.
¿Vamos bien de hora?
Sí, estamos sí. Si hay alguien presente en sala o sí, los que están viendo.
Very good.
No. Oh, well.
No, I wrote the question.
Oh, you write it down. No, you can send it to me as an email.
Okay. Before you were talking about the recollection of information and the use of intelligence. We know that the wars usually brings a fan of information, and in the Spanish Successions War, especially in the Spanish monarchy, it happens a collapse of intelligence nets when they lost the territories. They began to search information and analyzing information. Do you think that this kind of information that begins to be more available for facts of the world, and it creates an information market?
Another concept.
What about? What do you think about this? Or if you have an opinion?
I think there's probably always an information market. Yeah, and so that the corruption of officials, for example, to buy information is this is a market process. You're buying the information. Yeah, so I think it's always I think it's interesting what you said about the collapse of an information network in the War of Spanish Succession. I have to confess, and I wasn't aware of that, but I can see how the loss of Flanders, the loss of Milan, the loss of all these territories.
When they lost the connection with Vienna, no?
Yeah, they lose these local people and a whole network of connections. That's quite, and to be honest, I'm just not aware. Maybe it's just I haven't read enough of people writing about this, about the intelligence gathering and its breakdown in the War of the Spanish Succession.
Well, I'm writing.
Oh,
No.
very good. No,
No.
I always say,
No. It's
Yeah.
think about the relation clientelar relationship in Rome during the secession.
oh, in Rome,
Yes.
right?
And then in Rome, there is a market. There
Yes.
is a market because
Yeah.
a lot of people, they can get the information. Secretario, servants, the
Rome,
men
yeah.
in the street.
There's all this underworld of vagabonds, criminals in Rome, and I think it's a little bit like The Hague.
Right.
Madrid itself is a big center of intelligence and information. Yeah, these are really important. But Rome must be probably in Western Europe the most important.
Yes, in this moment there is it is neutral. It's neutral. They don't involve the war. So all the contendentes,
Yeah.
los participantes
Oh.
de la guerra están todos ahí, ¿no?
Pretenders.
Pretenders.
All the
Los
pretenders.
acusados
Yeah.
están.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting subject.
In the first, se me escucha bien.
Perfecto.
In the first place, I want to apologize for my English.
No, I have far more to apologize with my Spanish.
I would like to know which one are the main difference between Spaniard and British historiography.
The main difference is, I think, probably being at all interested in Spain, right? But yeah, we buy into this narrative of decline, and I don't know. Do you know the work of Richard Kagan, the Prescott paradigm?
He's coming to the Ciclo.
Oh,
Coming to the Ciclo.
right. Well, he did this article, Prescott's Paradigm. Prescott, this American historian, and all these Protestant, and we are superior to you, and so on. So I think a lot of British people sort of buy. Come on, we've been through Brexit.
One thing I have an special interest in, it's not only the vision about Spain, but the way of work. The way of work, the documentation, no? Which one are the main difference?
Of course, the way British historians use the primary materials and the way.
Yes.
Oh, okay. This is.
You see there are any significant difference?
To be honest, I don't. But you've asked me a more interesting question than I think I've ever thought about before. I wonder if Spanish historians like to have big blocks of quotes from original materials, when I suppose in Britain maybe we like smaller, briefer quotes, and we're more critical of them. But I mean, look, I wouldn't bet my shirt on that.
Maybe more work for each document in British historiography.
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Not a lot of documents for one paragraph, but more reflexive, se dice? Reflexion.
Maybe, but it also, of course, depends on individuals, individual historians. So I don't think I would say it's a hard and fast rule about how the two schools of historians work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Uy,
Se escucha bien, se escucha bien.
sorprendí un poco. I wanted to thank, first of all, Alberto and Mario for these really such interesting interviews. I wanted to ask, maybe you've talked about it as I've come and go, I'm not sure about it, but in many other Cleos we have talked, or they have asked about how do you see, not about a publication to the academic but having in mind the general public, and also in relation to education, how can we transmit those knowledge and those new ideas first to the students in university and especially to the general public, because here we do have a big problem, because usually it's not historians that write the books that are bought by the general public, but
Journalists.
by journalists.
Journalists.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's not historians who are writing, and journalists who do not have maybe the necessary knowledge to do it. So we kind of have their problem. Maybe in England it's the same or not, or maybe you could talk about your vision as a foreign in Spain into this issue. Thank you.
This is a good question. We have touched on public history before, but there's always more to be said. Now, one of the things I find is when I met students in the past, and I think, well, they say they're critical of the people who teach them. They say, you criticize all these things I thought I knew, right? And you say, so why are you at university studying history? And I think a lot of students are at university studying history because they just want more of the same.
Mm-hmm.
So they think, oh, I love reading about Isabella and Ferdinando and the conquest of Granada, and then the Italian Wars, and then the discovery of America. And I just want you to tell me more and more. And instead, what we do at universities, we say, well, hang on, you thought this about Ferdinand and Isabella, but in reality, this is what really happened. And how do you know anyway? How do you know what you think you know about Ferdinand and Isabella and you thought was so wonderful? And so we undermine their sort of sense of what they know and understand about the past. So one of our challenges is to get students to understand that studying history is not just accumulating more knowledge, more facts, but adopting a historical mindset, that you understand how the past is reconstructed, first of all, and then interpreted. And this, it seems to me, is a really important thing for us as historians. And yet journalists write books. They all want these books about the sex life of the Bourbons, right? You know what? You know. It frustrates me. I go in and well, every week I get this new update from Martial Pons. New books about the private life of Charles IV and whoever of Parma, and Godoy and all that sort of thing. And if only it were true. But yeah, it's okay. So how do we do it?
Yeah.
Do we just write better books? Better books. Or we say, look, the reality, which isn't the sex life of the Bourbons, is actually more exciting and more interesting.
Thanks, Mr. Storrs. What did Italy mean for the Spanish monarchy?
What did Italy? Oh, Italy. Whoa, well. It's interesting because in a way, I think it meant more than America. Because I think about all these Spaniards in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, to how many of them did America mean anything? So we have the number who might migrate. We have the number who have family members who may have migrated. So they're developing family connections across the Atlantic. But people living in, I'm just thinking of pueblos in Castilla, just outside Valladolid. Maybe Astorga's a bit bigger than a pueblo, isn't it? So sorry if anybody's from Astorga. But a small pueblo in Valladolid province, what would America mean to them? Now, that it might mean more to them Italy, because they might have been recruited to serve in Italy. And I just sometimes think that we all think, well, Spain in the early modern period, it's all about the treasure of America and all that sort of thing. But actually, there are some other territories, well, like the North African Presidios, right? So there's all sorts of aspects of the Spanish monarchy, which I think we probably undervalue. And mainly, wouldn't you just love to be a raw recruit, a bisogno, who's recruited and he goes to spend 6 months in Sicily or Naples, and he may then move up to Milan, but he's never really going to be sent to fight in Flanders. He's leading a very fine life, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I want to ask you, and I'm wondering if you ever heard about the concept of Sistema Imperiale Spagnolo, because it was made up by an Italian historic, Aurelio Musi.
Muti.
Aurelio Musi, and it's basically made up the concept on this idea that not only Italy means more than America, but the European context means more to the Spanish world than the American world, based on a larger tradition, jurisdictionally. Tradition. It's larger in Europe, in the European world, than the American world.
Okay, I'm sort of more or less familiar with the idea of an imperial system, and this is one of the things that contributes to the survival of the Spanish monarchy. It's got this brilliant system for moving resources around Europe where they're needed, from, say, Spain to the south of Italy, up through Italy to Milan, and then maybe up to Flanders. So it's a fairly well integrated system. I don't think any other state has such an integrated power system. And also, where you were saying it actually is a bit older than the connection with America. And of course, we have to think about the Aragonese crown has got all this much older connection dating back to the 13th century in the case of Sicily with the Sicilian Vespers. So it's a very old, well-entrenched system. And it's probably one of the reasons why when Spain loses so much of Spanish Italy in the War of the Spanish Succession, there are these people in these former Spanish territories in Italy who retain a sense of a Spanish identity. So when the Spanish forces land in Sicily in 1718, they are welcomed back by many in the population. And the kings of Sardinia, who lose Sicily in 1720 and are given Sardinia in return, they find when they're trying to reform things in Sardinia in the second half of the century, that the language still spoken quite widely is Spanish. So it's really interesting that there is this enduring sense of being part of a bigger community. And maybe we're wrong to call it Spanish or Italian. It's something unique, which is Spanish and Italian, which Spanish plus Italian equals something entirely different, which is neither of the two, which is a sort of an amalgam of the two identities.
¿No? Creo que si nadie tiene más preguntas, también para los que están conectados online. Bueno, can I speak in Spanish, Professor? Or...
You've done very well. You're going to thank me, but actually I thank the two of you for you've done very well in
English. No, and would like to again thank you very much for being here with us today. We know Simancas is awaiting for you tomorrow, and on Friday Simancas is awaiting. But to Alberto and I, and to everyone who is here, we are beginning in our academic, let's say, path or career and have the possibility to speak with you about the Spanish monarchy, Italy, but even more about history in general. It's a huge honor. It's quite a gift for us, and we are very thankful for you coming here with us.
Well, thank you. Well, talking about history, this is the most wonderful thing I can think of. Right, I can't think of anything better
than talking about history.
Talking about history
In Madrid.
It's my life. It's what I have been, and I still am a historian. And I cannot think of a better thing to be in life.
Así que, insisto, muchas gracias a todos. La verdad, les agradecemos mucho con Alberto que estén presentes en esta que fue la 10ª sesión de Clío ante el espejo. Y recordamos que la próxima será el miércoles 12, el miércoles siguiente, entre las 11 y las 13 de la mañana, con el profesor Richard Kagan, que muy amablemente accederá a hablar con nosotros sobre estos temas y muchos otros. Así que muchas gracias a todos, les agradecemos. Thank you, Professor Storrs, for being here, y nos vemos la semana que viene.